The 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly is called to order. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. A few days ago, on the 6th of December, in my quality as President of the Security Council for this month, I received an exceptional letter, and in that, for the first time in more than 30 years, the Secretary-General invoked Article 99 of the United Nations Charter, and that enables him to call the attention of the Security Council to any matter which, in his view, could threaten international peace and security. He did this given the huge loss of lives in Gaza in the last 2 months since the terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October, and in order to avoid a total collapse, a disaster with consequences that could be irreversible for peace and security in the region. And he did this because the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate rapidly, and I was able to see this personally a few days ago at the Rafah crossing. Mr. President, Ecuador has been clear in condemning robustly, unequivocally, the unjustifiable and atrocious terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, as well as asking that all hostages be freed unconditionally, immediately. And we have said this on various occasions, and we do this again today. We've also been very clear in recognizing that the Palestinian people have an inalienable right to their legitimate aspirations to live in security, freedom, justice, have opportunities, and live in dignity. We have expressed our solidarity with Israel and with Palestine because all lives are valuable, and we are hurt by all those that die and are injured. No innocent parties should be injured or die. We've said that Israel has the right to defend its people, and also it must adhere to international humanitarian law and human rights law in exercising that right. We've also rejected the use of humans by Hamas as shields, human shields. Our position has been clear, and it's been based on international law for the defense of life and on human dignity. These are the principles that guide us in this and all matters. These are the principles that will continue to guide us. Mr. President, we've been drawn together here in this General Assembly after a veto in the Security Council to consider a draft resolution and amendments to the text. In accordance with the principles that I just announced just now, I think a humanitarian ceasefire is necessary to alleviate the terrible situation in Gaza and to avoid a conflagration in the area. We also feel it's necessary that this Assembly explicitly condemn Hamas for the attacks of the 7th of October, which unfortunately was not done in a timely way in the resolution adopted on the 27th of October. We believe that it's indispensable to clearly point out the clear responsibilities today in order to ensure that we know who is responsible for what in the future. And that's why we voted in favour of the resolution and the 2 amendments that were put forward. And finally, Mr. President, I reiterate what my delegation has said repeatedly in this General Assembly, in the Security Council, and other fora. The almost 8 decades now of conflict, the thousands and thousands of deaths, the terrible suffering of this generation and future generations makes it clear that violence is not the solution. The only way to put an end to this conflict is through a peaceful solution that is negotiated, lasting and just for the parties, with the existence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and pertinent resolutions. And we will all work together to achieve that. Thank you.
I thank you, the distinguished ambassador of Ecuador. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
Your Excellency, the President, ladies and gentlemen, may the peace of God be upon you. We are meeting today once again in this august hall, the hall of the General Assembly, against the backdrop of a repeated and deliberate blocking of the Security Council. The Council was prevented from taking practical, tangible measures that would maintain international peace and security, measures that would end the killing of the Palestinian civilians, including elderly women and children. The convening of this emergency special session reflects our collective rejection of the collective punishment and the ethnic cleansing against a whole population, to allow for the implementation of racist policies unseen since World War II. We gather here today after 2 months of a deliberate obstruction of the Security Council, despite explicit calls by the international community, represented by the General Assembly, the Security Council, and represented by the position of the UN Secretary General, whom we salute for supporting peace, international law, and international humanitarian law. We also pay tribute to the overwhelming number of member states which stood by right justice, calling for an immediate and unconditional end to the killing of civilians in Gaza. The world and peace-loving peoples will not forget that Israel was granted the green light to persist in its crimes against the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people, whose only crime was rejecting occupation and expressing repeatedly its right to exercise freedom and other legitimate rights, including the right to self-determination. We reaffirm that the genocide and ethnic cleansing are refused. We hold Israel, the occupying force, accountable, and we hold accountable all those supporting it in committing this crime. This wanton aggression has been undermining the legitimacy of the Security Council, the Council of whom we have always been proud, and we were proud of its role in maintaining international peace and security. The struggle of the Palestinian people and other peace-loving peoples have unveiled the plans that were being promoted regarding democracy, freedoms, and other fake slogans. What we are witnessing today in Palestine is totally in contradiction with what you have been calling for. Unfortunately, you have lost all these standards by implementing your double standards in the Gaza Strip and in other regions of the world. Regrettably, such a conduct is undermining this organization and the legitimacy of the Security Council. The only constant truth is that Israel's plans since 1948 have reached a stalemate in the face of the persistence and resistance of the Palestinian people. Occupation, liquidation, and forcible displacement have failed against the steadfastness of Gaza. All the peoples of the world are today supporting the Palestinian people in its struggle and its just cause. They are calling for an international order that would uphold the human value wherever he is in the world. A global order that is based on the protection of people and equality. This is the message that was adopted by an overwhelming majority of the member states in this very hall of the General Assembly. This is a message calling for ending injustice, not only against the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people, but against all the peoples looking forward to freedom and to exercising their legitimate inalienable right to self-determination. In conclusion, Mr. President, some have tried to silence the voice of Palestine. The surprise was that the whole world has been expressing the voice of Palestine. The world is aware today that terrorism is what Israel has been doing in full view of the world. But the voice of humanity has been stronger, and you will all scream, "We are all Palestine." Thank you, President.
I thank you, the distinguished representative of Oman. Now I invite the distinguished representative of Finland to take the floor.
Mr. President, the escalation of hostilities, first in Israel and then in the Palestinian territory, has now lasted for over 2 months. The scale of human suffering and the extensive loss of life is shocking. Last week, Finland co-sponsored and voted in favor of the General Assembly resolution demanding an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and ensuring humanitarian access. Finland has also condemned the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel in the strongest terms. Over 1,200 people lost their lives in the attack, most of them civilians. Hamas and other groups still hold hostages in Gaza, and we demand their immediate and unconditional release. Terrorism is never justified, and Finland fully recognizes Israel's right to protect its civilian population from terrorist attacks. However, we have also strongly and consistently underlined that military operations must be proportionate and in line with international humanitarian law. All possible measures to spare civilian lives must be taken in all situations. Since the start of Israel's military operation, almost 20,000 people have reportedly been killed in Gaza, most of them women and children. Tens of thousands of others have been injured. Homes have been destroyed, and nearly 2 million people have been displaced. The humanitarian situation is catastrophic, and not nearly enough aid is reaching those in need. Secretary General Guterres has sounded the loudest possible alarm on the imminent danger of the catastrophic humanitarian situation deteriorating even further and the humanitarian system collapsing. Civilian life must be protected, and aid cannot be delivered while the fighting rages. Finland therefore joins the SG's call for a humanitarian ceasefire to ensure the protection of civilians and the delivery of enough life-saving aid throughout Gaza. International humanitarian law must be respected by all parties. The suffering of civilians must end. Mr. President, the risk of a wider escalation also remains high. The tensions in the broader region, especially in the border area between Israel and Lebanon, have intensified, and we call on all actors in the region to de-escalate. In the West Bank, the international efforts to de-escalate are hampered by the increasing violence of Israeli settlers. Israel has the legal obligation to protect civilians also from the violence of Israeli citizens residing in the settlements, which are all illegal under international law. The situation once again demonstrates that we need a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on the pre-1967 borders. Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem together form the Palestinian territory. The future solution must meet both Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty, end the occupation that began in 1967, and resolve all permanent status issues. We all know that this is the only sustainable way to ensure peace and security for everyone in the region. It is high time to make a renewed international effort to resolve this conflict. The people in the region finally deserve a future without violence. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative for Finland. Maintenant, je donne la parole.
And I now give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, France is gravely alarmed by the humanitarian tragedy which is currently underway in Gaza. The Secretary General raised the alarm last week, and he rightly did so. The situation has drastically deteriorated since the resumption of hostilities on the 1st of December. Humanitarian organizations have been vocal about their inability to deliver humanitarian assistance to civilians under the present-day circumstances. For this reason, France voted in favor of the resolution submitted by the UAE at the Security Council Friday. And for this reason, France supported in favor of the Egyptian resolution at the General Assembly. And for this reason, we advocate a new immediate, sustained humanitarian truce that should result in a sustainable ceasefire. France, from the very outset, supported Israel's right to self-defense and the duty to do so strictly in line with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to protect civilians. Hamas and other terrorist groups perpetrated barbaric and inhumane crimes against civilians, women, and Israeli civilians, women, and children. We reiterate our emphatic condemnation in the firmest terms of these acts, specifically the sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups on 7 October. For this reason, France voted in favor of the U.S. amendment. We also regret the fact that the Egyptian resolution fails to recall that diversion of assistance and the use of civilian infrastructure for military purposes constitute violations of the principles of humanitarian action and international humanitarian law. France calls for the immediate, unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other terrorist groups. For this reason, we voted in favor of the Austrian amendment. France recalls that this call aligns with international law and that it was clearly set out by the Security Council in Resolution 2712. We question the reasons behind the fact that the call for the release of hostages was not set out in UN texts. We will continue to resolutely commit to efforts at the Security Council, General Assembly, and in the region to resolve the crisis in all of its dimensions at the security, humanitarian, and especially political level. Thank you. I thank the representative of France.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Comoros.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I wish to begin by thanking you, Mr. President, for having convened in a brief period of time this meeting which is of paramount importance. I also wish to thank the permanent representatives of Egypt and of Mauritania, respectively President of the Arab Group and of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I thank them for having issued the request to resume the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly. Mr. President, today we are resuming this 10th special emergency session with a feeling of tremendous frustration. The devastating, catastrophic situation that Palestinian civilians have been enduring is intolerable and is of concern to all of us. The calls of member states have fallen on deaf ears, as has the call of the Secretary General, who, pursuant to Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations, alerted the Security Council to the devastating situation in Gaza. Likewise, the voices of the majority of the membership of the Security Council have also been ignored. It is noteworthy that more than 100 countries have co-sponsored Resolution S/2023/970, demonstrating significant international concern, and yet the persistent blockage of the Security Council raises critical questions related to its credibility and has also spawned grave humanitarian consequences, specifically in the area of health, the risk of famine, or the complete collapse of the humanitarian support system. Mr. President, the alarming situation endured by UNRWA and the increase in the number of its victims, including the families of UNRWA employees, also reflects the denial of the basic rights under international law and under international humanitarian law. In the light of these challenges, our responsibility is to protect the civilian populations, and this is a responsibility that is more important than ever before. What moral justification can be advanced in inflicting this collective indiscriminate punishment, which has caused thousands of dead, in particular women and children? In this context, Egypt, on behalf of the Arab group and the OIC, called for the implementation of Resolution 377, Uniting for Peace, so that we can meet here and rise to the expectations of the expected of the international community. This situation also sheds light on the urgent need for Security Council reform, which is of paramount importance for the smooth operations of our organization. Mr. President, the Union of the Comoros rejects violence. We call on the parties to immediately de-escalate. This conflict has caused far too many casualties, and we call for the return of hostages in order to reopen the door to dialogue and together to arrive at a sustained two-state solution as is stipulated in the relevant UN resolutions. And lastly, I wish to emphasize the importance of collective responsibility incumbent upon us to adopt an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. In a number of regions in Gaza, access for essential humanitarian assistance has been gravely obstructed, leaving thousands of civilians in grave need. These are areas which are inaccessible to basic resources, are cruelly lacking. And this is a testament to the silence of human suffering. This dire situation requires not only immediate action on our part, but also coordinated and decisive efforts. This is our duty as an international community to guarantee that humanitarian assistance can reach those in need in Gaza. And yet there have been major barriers to this humanitarian mission, and one of these barriers is the absence of a sustained ceasefire. Without peace, our efforts to deliver vital support are constantly being obstructed. We together need to advance an immediate ceasefire to pave the way for consistent humanitarian assistance. Furthermore, it is of paramount importance for the management of this humanitarian assistance to be carried out under the aegis of the international community. This will guarantee the equitable and effective and efficient delivery and distribution of assistance and will prevent the politicization of humanitarian assistance. Our objective needs to remain clear, namely to save lives and to preserve human dignity. As a member of the United Nations, we shoulder collective responsibility to protect and to assist those most vulnerable. For this reason, my country, the Union of the Comoros, voted in favor of Resolution A/ES-10/L27, entitled Protection of Civilians and Respect for Legal and Humanitarian Obligations. These are not merely deliberations. This is a vital, pressing need to save lives which are imperiled. We need to act without further delay. This is the House of the United Nations based on values which we need to respect, to act now to prevent the annihilation of the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Union des...
I thank the representative of the Union of the Comoros.
The floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has deteriorated to an unprecedented level. The fact that the emergency special session has been convened again within just 2 months underscores this stark reality. In light of the current humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Japan voted in favor of the GA resolution, which gained a majority of the voices of the international community with 153 votes in favor. The unimaginable death toll, rampant displacement, a collapsed healthcare system, and now mass starvation, which have all happened within such a short period of time, demonstrate the gravity of this crisis. In this regard, Japan takes seriously the Secretary General's invocation of Article 99 of the UN Charter, urging the members of the Security Council to appeal for a humanitarian ceasefire. Although it's regrettable that the Security Council has not been able to take sufficient action, serious diplomatic efforts are underway to make a tangible difference in improving the humanitarian situation on the ground. In fact, the diplomatic efforts led by the countries concerned, including the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, achieved the welcome week-long pause we saw at the end of November, which resulted in the release of some hostages and the entry of vital humanitarian aid into Gaza. However, since this pause broke down, this has been a new round of deaths, displacement, and destruction. It is evident that immensely more aid needs to be delivered through all available routes to and throughout Gaza. Moreover, reiterating our condemnation of the terror attack on 7th October, Japan again calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas and others. Mr. President, UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini said in his letter to the President of the General Assembly dated 7th December, the agency is at the darkest hour in its 75-year history. More than 130 of its staff have been killed in bombardments, most with their families. Japan expresses its heartfelt sympathy to the victims and the injured, and offers its condolences to the bereaved families. All parties to the conflict must comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, UN personnel, and humanitarian workers. As a responsible member of the Security Council, Japan will continue to work constructively with other Council members to foster a unified voice that addresses the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Resolution 2712 is a crucial first step, but it's not enough. In Gaza, gunfire and bombardment continue even now. They must stop immediately for a period that allows for meaningful humanitarian operations for those who are suffering this humanitarian catastrophe. Ultimately, a two-state solution where Israel and an independent Palestinian state living side by side in peaceful coexistence and security remains the only viable solution. But for now, the international community must prioritize an end to the suffering and save the lives of the innocent. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. Now I invite distinguished representative of Uruguay to take the floor.
We would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this session. The renewal of this special session is due to the serious situation in the Middle East, which continues to create great concern amongst the entire international community. The situation in the Middle East, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the situation is really lamentable. Since the 7th of October, when there were a series of attacks, brutal attacks by Hamas against Israel and its citizens. After that, we saw this spiral of military reactions, taking of hostages to Israel, the destruction of hospitals and housing in Gaza, and a high number of civilian victims, including women and children, Palestinian women and children, and United Nations staff. Uruguay condemned the inhumane terrorist attacks of the 7th of October by Hamas. This action against Israel and its citizens undoubtedly led to what we're seeing in Gaza now. But we must be clear, my government firmly condemns terrorism, whoever commits it, wherever, and we ask for an immediate release of the hostages unconditionally. The situation of all civilians in Israel and Gaza and the occupied territories, we're concerned about them all. They should not have to pay the price of military confrontation. They should not be included in that. And in that regard, we welcome Resolution 2712 of the Security Council, and we regret that it wasn't possible to agree the resolution presented in that same council by the UAE. Here we appreciate the pause that was negotiated by Qatar and the US that allowed some Israeli hostages to be released and some humanitarian aid to reach the Gazans. That pause, and we thank those countries that were able to arrange that, shows us the way forward. And we would ask the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he asked for the same thing. And Uruguay, in this context, would like to join in the call for humanitarian pause and humanitarian corridors. It is essential that humanitarian access be provided for UN agencies and the Red Cross, that this be full and secure and unhindered. Hundreds of thousands are waiting for basic food and for drinking water. We believe that the General Assembly should support this option, including the freeing of all hostages, and provide security for humanitarian access for a prolonged period. That's why we believe that the resolution that was voted on in this General Assembly, Special Assembly, should contain all aspects of the situation: the need for hostilities to cease, so that human life will not be lost, and humanitarian law must be respected in order to provide access to Gaza, and also there must be full condemnation of Hamas's attack, and we must take into account Israel's concern for their security. Given all of these aspects, and given that they were not included in a balanced way in the resolution, we felt that we had to abstain in the vote. Uruguay defends in our foreign policy the protection of civilians in conflict. We will continue to do this. We would recall that Uruguay co-sponsored Resolution 2286 of 2016, dealing with attacks on hospitals and medical staff and humanitarian staff at the time, constituting violations of international law. Uruguay once again expresses its concern, and we express our solidarity with the thousands of innocent civilians that have died and been wounded in this conflict. There is no justification for this. The solution to this painful crisis can be provided by international law and international humanitarian law. Both parties must listen carefully to what the international community is asking and requesting with regard to this situation. Progress must be made in dialogue where there is peace based on international law, and that should lead to comprehensive permanent agreements. We can't delay this. There needs to be a return to the table of negotiations on the basis of the two-state solution, which will give Israel secure borders and enable the Palestinian people to exercise their rights. Thank you.
I thank you, Excellency, Ambassador of Uruguay. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by aligning the UAE with the statements delivered on behalf of the Arab Group and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I would like to welcome the important resolution adopted last week in the General Assembly with an overwhelming majority calling for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. This important measure embodies the international community's desire to end the brutal situation suffered by the Palestinian people in Gaza. During the last period, the indiscriminate attacks by Israel in Gaza led to the death of 19,000 civilians and an injury of many, many more, while so many continue to lie under the rubble. These horrifying numbers are not just statistics. They embody the loss of life, dreams, families, and injured children who have been left unaccompanied, without family and without health care. The Gaza Strip today is the most dangerous place in the world for children. After 8,000 children have died and neighborhoods have become piles of rubble. Every passing hour without a ceasefire means continued rise in casualties and a continued humanitarian crisis that is unprecedented. Therefore, we continue to call for an immediate ceasefire and call for abiding by the international humanitarian law and international law. And we emphasize that the UAE continues its efforts and continues its support of the Egyptian efforts to achieve a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and achieve a truce in the Gaza Strip. The inhabitants of the Gaza Strip continue to suffer. More than 1.9 million displaced persons in Gaza, and the military Israeli machine continues its attack. The people suffer a severe shortage in all requirements for life, leading to a spread of disease and hunger. This is a brutal reality that requires immediate, urgent action to protect civilians and to provide humanitarian access, in particular fuel that is necessary for the medical sector. The members of the Security Council, current and prospective, have participated in the visit to the Rafah crossing last week. They have witnessed the extent of the suffering, and they have listened to warnings by UN officials about the disruption in the humanitarian system and the near total collapse of the system, and they have witnessed the great efforts by Egypt for humanitarian access into Gaza. And during this suffocating crisis, we emphasize the important role of the international community, in particular the Security Council, to continue humanitarian access in an unimpeded manner. Therefore, the UAE has presented a draft resolution to the Council to increase humanitarian access. And in this regard, we emphasize that the UAE will continue to support the Palestinian people during this difficult time. We have recently announced building 3 desalination plants near the border in Egypt in order to secure drinking water for 300,000 people every day. We have inaugurated the first of these 3 plants last week. The country has also established a field hospital in Gaza where many doctors and nurses from the UAE have volunteered in order to provide health care to injured and diseased Palestinians, including severely injured Palestinian children. We must not ignore the continued and rapid deterioration, in particular in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank. The occupation affects the daily life, and raids continue by Israelis targeting cities and refugee camps, while the settler violence continues to rise. In conclusion, we must emphasize that peace and stability in the occupied Palestinian territory and the region as a whole does not lie in just a ceasefire, but it requires addressing the root causes of the conflict. The occupation must end. We must move towards serious negotiations sponsored by the international community and based on the agreed terms of reference in order to implement the 2-state solution and establish an independent sovereign Palestinian state on the borders of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you, Mr. President.
Distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates. Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nigeria.
Mr. President, Nigeria aligns itself with a statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, as well as statement delivered by Zambia on behalf of African Group. I would also like to thank Mr. President for convening this emergency special session on the situation in Palestine, in particular in the Gaza Strip. We would therefore like to make the following remarks in our national capacity. Nigeria wishes to lend its voice to the global call by state and civil societies in condemning the present wanton destruction of lives and properties in Gaza Strip, which has assumed a very critical dimension. Nigeria supports and reiterates call for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce between Israeli forces and Hamas in Gaza. Many lives, including women and children, have been lost since the commencement of the crisis in Israel and Palestine, with so many displaced. The daily increase of displaced persons and shortage of humanitarian supplies due to impeded access have greatly impacted on the people, exacerbated the humanitarian catastrophe in the region, and has increased civilian casualties. As a promoter and protector of human rights, Nigeria urges the parties in the conflict to uphold the fundamental values of international humanitarian law, which places premium on ensuring civilian safety and well-being. This should go beyond mere politics. Destruction of lives and properties, including of hospitals and religious and cultural sites, are a violation of international law. Nigeria therefore calls for a ceasefire and reiterates its call once again for quick de-escalation of hostilities by both sides, which should help us in getting to a two-state solution. This seemingly permanent cycle of violence needs to be broken. Mr. President, in conclusion, as part of the ministerial committee established by the Arab OIC Summit, we will continue to interface with global actors to find a lasting peaceful resolution of this decade-long problem in accordance with UN resolutions and principles of international law. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of El Salvador.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. If you could just give me one moment, please.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excuse that delay. We'd like to thank you for convening this important special emergency session addressing the serious situation in the Middle East, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where the conflict that has been going on now for more than 2 months has led to an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, leading to an incalculable number of deaths of civilians. Once again, we express our deep condolences for all of the victims in this fresh outbreak of violence. My delegation is extremely concerned at the extreme escalation of violence in the region, and we would call for an end to be put to the suffering of families in this region that have suffered atrocities and irreparable damage, human and material. According to the last UNRWA report on the situation in Palestine, dated 18 December, after 73 days of hostilities, more than 19,400 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 70% of women and children. 1.4 million people have been internally displaced in 155 UNRWA establishments. 136 members of UNRWA staff have been killed since the 7th of October. And on the list of human and material loss continues to increase day by day. My delegation voted in favor of the resolution and co-sponsored the resolution being considered in the ESS because we believe that it places at the heart of the situation the matters that come under the mandate of the General Assembly in the Charter of the United Nations. We also believe that the text is balanced with a clear intention, merely humanitarian, for an immediate ceasefire and the requirement that the parties meet their obligations in accordance with international law. We join in the call for an immediate ceasefire, and we would call upon the international community to use all of their influence to prevent a further escalation of violence and put an end to this crisis. Supporting firmly what was requested by the Secretary General on the 6th of December, asking the members of the Security Council to avoid a greater humanitarian disaster throughout the Gaza Strip. We condemn all acts of violence against the civilian population, and we call for the immediate freeing of the hostages, their security, their well-being, and human treatment in accordance with international humanitarian law and human rights law. Given the seriousness of the situation, my country reiterates its call for, in accordance with international humanitarian law, there be humanitarian corridors open that have full protection and that all civilian and humanitarian infrastructure be respected, including hospitals, medical facilities, means of transport and equipment, schools, places of worship, and United Nations facilities on the ground. It's important to ensure that civilians are not deprived of what is essential for their survival, and that's why we ask that there be humanitarian access provided immediately, full access, secure access, and without restrictions, so that the essential services such as water, food, medical supplies, fuel, electricity can reach all civilians. Mr. President, we reiterate what we have been repeating over the years in various fora. A lasting solution to this conflict can only be achieved through peaceful means, with willingness on both sides for a solution based on two states and based on the resolutions of the Security Council and the United Nations General Assembly. This is a time of crisis where we must bear in mind the importance of dialogue and the functioning of multilateral institutions which were maintained to preserve international peace and security, to strengthen cooperation between its member states, and to bring about the well-being of peoples. We call upon the parties to demonstrate that they are able to reach agreements for the general well-being in order to achieve peace and to put an end to human suffering. And in this regard, we recognize the leadership and the efforts and the fundamental role that has been played by the Arab nations in order to bring about a cessation of hostilities and ensure the protection of the civilian population and provide humanitarian assistance. As an international community, we must redouble our efforts aimed at promoting a just, lasting solution to the conflict. And that's why, as a matter of urgency, we require urgent efforts to begin negotiations for peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
I thank you, the distinguished representative of El Salvador. Now we have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. In accordance with the resolution ES-10/22 of 12 December 2023, the 10th emergency special session of the General Assembly is temporarily adjourned. The meeting is adjourned. I thank you.